Welcome to Advancing Cyber, where we explore the critical cybersecurity issues shaping today's geopolitical and business landscapes. Each episode brings together leaders from cyber law, policy, or technology to offer insights that cut through the complexity of the digital age. I'm Cristin Flynn Goodwin, a cybersecurity law and incident response expert. In today's episode, we'll explore the newest EU cybersecurity regulation exploring the world, DORA, the Digital Operational Resiliency Act, and other leading EU cybersecurity regulations and what they mean for U.S. companies. We'll also talk about what it means for U.S. cybersecurity influence globally when the EU sets the regulatory baseline and how that will impact companies for the foreseeable future. Today, we are joined by Chris Hale and Emily Lemaire. Chris Hale is Senior Director for Cyber and National Security Law at Cisco, where he leads the legal team responsible for advising on and driving compliance with cyber and national security laws globally. He's also a visiting fellow at the National Security Institute at George Mason University. Emily Lemaire is a financial services regulatory lawyer based in the London office of Covington Burling. As part of her practice, she advises global financial institutions and technology providers on the scope and implementation of the new digital operational resilience regime in the EU and its incoming counterpart in the UK. We'll have to talk about that. As always, the comments you hear today may reflect legal opinions, but do not constitute legal advice. So let's jump right into it. As always, we start with a little bit of cybersecurity history. The EU was late to the party on critical infrastructure when cybersecurity laws were getting started. And their early focus on cybersecurity back in 2013 was a very different focus from what the US was focused on. Back in 2013, the EU strategy prioritized distinctly European perspectives, protecting fundamental rights, freedom of expression, personal data, and privacy, and really had a consumer-first approach to cybersecurity. And early efforts were prioritizing services that were really consumer-based focuses like Facebook and MySpace and job boards like Monster.com. And it was really heavy lobbying from national governments and companies that moved the EU towards critical infrastructure protection in 2014. That was when we saw the US release the NIST cybersecurity framework, and we saw the EU release the first draft Network and Information Systems Directive, the NIS directive, in March 2014. We can debate which one had the greater impact, the NIS directive or the NIST framework, but that really set these two tracks in motion of getting us down this path of regulation or best practice. A lot has happened in the past 10 years. The EU had two major intersectional realities between NIS 1.0 and where we are today. I think the first was the overwhelming success from the European perspective of the general data protection regulation that had almost an American attitude towards fines, right? Go big or go home. And by going big, it got every major company around the world to comply. That attitude began a paradigm shift. To go on to my second point, when NIS 2.0, when that was revised in every major EU regulation since then, they all have outsized penalties to ensure compliance. We'll debate whether it's working and the consequences of the approach. All right, enough history. Let's get to the current day. We have a new EU regulation that went into effect. It was a 2-year ramp up to get us here. That's DORA. Emily, can you give us the background on the Digital Operational Resilience Act and how we got here?
Sure, Cristin. So I think it's helpful to start with why DORA was introduced to understand the aims of the regulation. So to state the obvious, financial services firms are extremely reliant on information and communication technologies to operate internally and to provide their services, particularly if we think about the rate of digitalizations of many of these financial services. So an easy example being the rapid shift from cash use to digital payment methods. Before DORA, there was no financial services regime as such to specifically address ICT risk. Rather, we had this fragmented approach that deferred member state to member state and financial services sector to sector. And it was all loosely tied together by this overarching objective to control and address operational risk. This meant, in effect, that the growing set of risks resulting from increased dependencies on technology between financial services firms and also on third-party providers weren't adequately being addressed. So DORA, which, as we mentioned, it started applying on the 17th of this month, was introduced to establish this comprehensive digital operational resilience framework that applies across EU financial services. And what's novel about DORA is that this is the first time we're seeing financial services legislation, at least in this part of the world, being expanded to apply directly to non-financial services providers. Because along with the enhanced expectation for the management of ICT risk by financial institutions, DORA also creates this oversight regime for certain ICT providers that are deemed critical to the delivery of financial services in the EU.
Let's unpack that a little bit, because it seems like this regulation is going to have a major impact way beyond the scope of the financial services sector. And so talk more about that downstream effect, because it seems like it's regulating the financial services sector, but it's really regulating the ICT providers of the financial services sector. Could you talk about that?
Sure. The way that I think about this is that DORA, there are two sides to it. So there are the direct obligations, and then there are the indirect obligations. So I mentioned in passing those firms that are going to be directly subject to DORA. In addition to the financial services firms, we've got those ICT service providers that are designated as systematically important to the provision of financial services. In terms of timing on those designations, that's not likely to happen until the second half of the year, because we're still waiting on member states to submit their lists of what firms they think should be designated. But now turning to the other half, so the indirect obligations. So DORA is also going to flow down to ICT providers that are not designated. And that's by function of the contractual obligations on financial institutions. So they're required to put in place specific terms in their contracts with ICT providers. Because of those obligations, DORA requirements will in part flow down to non-designated ICT providers as well.
Is that in place today, or is that coming?
The designation is coming second half of the year. The contractual arrangements should be in place today now.
Okay.
But in practice, we're seeing firms are having to prioritize their compliance. So we're not saying 100% compliance just yet.
Wow. That's a really interesting thing. And, we've been seeing this trend. It's been growing for some time as, we've seen the SEC regulation in the United States and moving more towards, from an IT sector perspective, this concept of compliance as a service. Chris, can you talk to what you're seeing in that space? And is DORA hitting your radar? Is that registering? And what are your thoughts on sort of this broader concept of compliance as a service and starting to deal with having to incorporate these requirements contractually with customers?
Sure. No, it's a good question. And as Emily mentioned, this regulation can impact two types of U.S. companies. First of all, there's, of course, U.S. financial institutions that operate in the EU and thus become completely covered by DORA. And then there's the other aspect, as Emily mentioned, where the in-scope financial institutions need to flow down now various security and resilience-related contractual obligations to their ICT third-party service providers, information technology communications service providers. So for sure, we see ICT vendors just across the industry doing a lot of work to ensure that they can give their financial institution customers comfort. And DORA is also very unique, as Emily mentioned, in that there are actually built-in clauses that financial institutions must flow down now to their ICT vendors. And so there's a lot of looking at those clauses, making sure that we can comply. I think that for a lot of the larger tech companies, in a lot of ways, they're doing a lot of this stuff already. Some of the companies that may not be doing this, maybe the smaller and medium size, may have perhaps more uplift to do. I mean, it just depends on what state they were already at. But definitely we see a lot of work going on in this area. We see, ICT vendors creating DORA addendums, creating materials that they can give the financial institutions that they can use and be comfortable that their vendors are complying. So yeah, we're seeing a whole lot of work here, and it's new. There's still some, as Emily was mentioning, there's some related regulations that are also supporting with DORA, and not all of them are complete yet, right? There are a few of the regulatory technical standards on subcontracting and threat-led penetration testing we're still waiting for. So in some ways, we're trying our best to comply with rules that are not fully yet complete.
So that's a really interesting challenge. I want to come back to that point of how you fully comply with something, how you eat a cake while it's still in the oven. But let's talk a little bit more about some of these direct obligations and some of these contractual terms. Can you unpack a little bit more? What are the actual obligations on companies, on these financial institutions that they have to meet? And just give a little more color on what are some of the things that companies have to do in order to make sure that they're meeting their operational resilience requirements.
So in terms of the financial institutions, it's really just enhance the risk management controls that they have in place, but also the monitoring obligations that they have over their own ICT functions, but also the vendors that they rely on. So it's really just kicked that up a massive notch. You mentioned there the contractual terms. So DORA is really prescriptive on the provisions that it requires financial institutions to set out in their agreements with ICT vendors. And how burdensome those provisions are will depend on whether the ICT vendor supports a critical or important function of a financial institution. And that is a pattern throughout the entire regulation. You see that there are more onerous requirements for any services that support those critical important functions. And effectively, that's where if you have a discontinuation or impairment of a particular ICT service, would that materially impair the soundness or the continuity of the financial institution services? So you see a lot of obligations that are kind of framed around that. I don't propose going into all of the contractual terms because there are a significant number of them, but I think the key ones revolve around, for those ICT vendors that support a critical important function, so providing full service level descriptions, having regular reporting of qualitative and quantitative performance targets to their financial institution customers, implementing and testing business contingency plans, and having in place those ICT security measures that are of a standard expected by financial institution customers. So quite subjective there as well. And then finally, you have those provisions around the right to monitor the ICT vendor's performance. So unrestricted really rights of access, inspection, audit by not only the FE, but also a competent authority. And in our experience, at least my team, we're seeing that it's just requiring a lot of tech providers to put in place formal internal access or inspection frameworks that guide how they approach those customer and also regulatory inspections. So things around like governance and escalation and how you treat highly sensitive or legally privileged information. So it's all things that they have to go through and think about. Chris, I'd be interested actually in hearing your perspective on this. If there are any other kind of key obligations in your view.
Yeah. So Emily, it's a good question. So, as we were talking about, this is an interesting regulation in that there's actually baked in clauses that financial institutions must flow down to their ICT vendor. So in some way, it's baked, right? There's a regulation. We have to look at it. We have to work with the financial institution to comply. So some of the ones that you talked about, those are obviously all important. And there's, as you mentioned, there's so many of them, right? But things like pen testing, things like audit rights, things like flowing down terms to your vendors and providing information about those vendors and locations, right? Those are some of the areas where I see a lot of ICT vendors really focusing on.
I think part of the tension in this space is that on the privacy side, the EU's been using model clauses for over 20 years. And so on the data privacy, control set side, I've been around a long time. So I remember the fights around the EU model clauses and how hard that was for companies to have to go through those iterations and work all of that into contracts. And all the uncertainty with customers, working that into agreements. So what I find so interesting about this is that this is really the first time we're seeing model clauses coming into the cybersecurity arena. And, there's a pro and a con here, right? The pro is that it normalizes the questions. So instead of companies getting hit with slightly different versions of similar questions, which happens in the US all the time, you get much more normalized standard questions. So I take that pain, but at the same time, once companies go through the pain of the exercise of developing the processes and the answers, and it's done. So I think that's a really important point for American companies, is that this is the first time we're seeing model clauses hitting the cybersecurity sector. It will not be the last. And so as much as we're seeing, and what we're going to talk about penalties, and I implied it a little bit in the intro, where we saw success from the outsized penalties or GDPR having a knock-on effect. I think model clauses are something else we'll see cascading into future cybersecurity compliance regulations. So that's just my, old lady cyber perspective on that one. So I had read in some of the technical standards in DORA that there's a 2-hour restoration for critical services. Am I reading that right? Emily, you're a little closer to this. Am I taking away that inference correctly, that for financial institutions that they should have the resiliency to restore their critical services within 2 hours?
Well, I think the hope is that that's going to be applied a bit more proportionately. So the big thing about DORA is, and it appears up front, is that all the requirements, although they seem quite technical, they need to be applied proportionately. So maybe, yes, 2 hours, but I think that's going to be a big call for firms to make to be able to comply with.
Yeah, that's the thing that I find so fascinating about DORA, is that it applies to everything from your largest bank to your small starting venture cap firm. So that's a really good point. But it does put pressure on this concept of resiliency. And I think is some of the larger ICT providers are having to wrestle with their own outages and their own disruptions. That's where I think this gets really interesting, because if the expectation is rapid resiliency, you see one of the big cloud providers has an outage for some reason. How are those critical services going to be able to be resilient to a level that is satisfactory in the EU, given the level of fines that are on the table? Let's talk a little bit about some of the fines, because our friends in the EU have a very Jerry Maguire approach here. And so Emily, what are the EU DORA fines looking like for failure to comply?
So if it does get there, it's up to 1% of the average daily worldwide turnover of the ICT provider. So pretty hefty. And alongside those financial penalties, we've also got some other sanctions, the most extreme of which being banning financial entities from using that particular provider services. So yeah, as to when we'll start seeing those kind of sanctions, I think we're still a while yet, because I think there is a process under DORA for there to be some sort of cooperation back and forth between ICT providers, and I'm thinking about the designated ones, and the authorities. And I think there's going to have to be a learning experience for a while for those regulators to really understand how ICT providers function. I mean, the number one thing that we're seeing is that ICT providers are not structured like financial institutions, like banks. They don't have your 3 lines of defense model, et cetera. So it's really understanding just how they operate. And a lot of them are needing to be flexible and dealing with things as they come. So it's really a culture shift for them as well.
Yeah, for sure. When financial regulators first learn about an incident or an outage on Twitter, I think it's going to be a little different sort of experience for them. So what are the top 2 or 3 takeaways for companies that they need to think about with DORA, right? Because we're now at the point of compliance after 2 years. So if you're talking to a CISO, Emily, what are the top 2 or 3 things that you want a CISO to know about this regulation? Then I'll ask you, Chris.
For me, I think, and I'm particularly thinking about less so your sophisticated ICT providers, but your smaller, perhaps less sophisticated one. It's not a matter of if these incidents are going to happen, it's a matter of when, right? So it's kind of shifting as not waiting until it happens, but rather needing to be on top of those preventative measures. And that is, I think, what the regulators are trying to instill in ICT providers that hasn't been there in the past. And to have this kind of cooperation throughout all the supply chain, et cetera, in order to be able to prevent, but also address these issues when they're happening. So I think it's mostly a matter of approach for me when I look at DORA.
Yeah, from my perspective, I agree with everything Emily just said. And I think that, companies, ICT vendors should be aware that, as Emily mentioned, European regulators are going to designate critical ICT vendors and directly regulate them. So as Emily said, folks are thinking that the latter half of this year. So people should be aware of that. And I would also just mention, obviously, the fines as well. People should be aware of the fines that can be issued to banks or to critical ICT vendors that are designated under the law. And of course, the last thing I would mention is, as we see with DORA, the word R is resilience. It's operational resilience. It regulates not just security, but also resilience. And so that's an area where I would posit that here in the United States, the regulation on resilience is more in an infancy phase compared to Europe. So people should be aware that it's not just security, but also resilience, that is the subject of the regulation.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Chris. One of the things that I find so difficult about European regulation is that it takes 1,000 words to say what you could say in 5. But when you're reading the details, particularly in the technical standards about what's coming, one of the things that I find particularly troublesome about this regulation is that it gets into the details of how companies should be managing risk down to the level of project management or change management. And so the areas where a regulator could find fault are so broad that it really means that CISOs need to have a comprehensive risk management approach and that it has to be well documented. And so if the approach isn't being followed, that's where the challenge will be. Mistakes can happen and incidents can occur, but that as a part of the overall risk profile, in operational security and network security and all the details that the EU lists that are priorities, down to the worker level of project management and change management, that's got to be documented. And you have to have training and awareness and processes to make sure that your team members are following it. And if not, that's where, if you have a major incident, you can run into the death by 1,000 paper cuts problem. So I just wanted to do a bottom-up focus on that because I think it's easy to focus on the top-down problems, but that's a bottom-up problem that I did want to call out.
No, I'd agree with that. And also process of escalation. So does your worker at the bottom line know when to escalate and to whom at each level, at each juncture of the service that is being provided? Quite often, I think there will be different processes in different departments, but do they know exactly what to do? It has to be reported in some way and formalized, and that has to be approved at the top levels to make sure that it's all cohesive as well.
For sure. And as we start getting into how do you attest to these programs and processes and how do you start to be able to prove that you're following these processes, the more you can standardize now and the more you can train and consistently show this now, the better off you'll be. So thoughts and prayers for our friends in CISO land working on DORA. Let's talk a little bit about NIST 2.0 because this regulation's recently come into effect as well. I think, we watched the first Network Information Systems Directive was particularly underwhelming, but it was the EU's first foray into regulation, and fines ranged between 15,000 euros and 50,000 euros for failure to comply. It was a sort of a nebulous requirement regime for operators of essential services and digital security providers that were operating in Europe. When you identified your principal places of business, you had your national authority, that your national competent authority. So if your primary place of business was Ireland, you were designated your Irish authority. If you had an outage that met one of the requirements in the statute, say 1 million hours of which could be aggregated across customers, then you'd have to report. It turned out that was really hard to do and didn't meet that threshold very often. So we saw the EU say, whoops, that's not enough. Let's reset this. And so that's what happened with NIS 2.0. Emily, I'm sure you were neck deep in counseling clients on this one since you're based overseas. Why don't you give us an overview of NIS 2.0 and what you've been sharing with your clients?
Of course. So as you said, NIS2 builds on this one, but it really expands the types of organizations that fall in the scope of the requirements. And you have new and more granular security and incident reporting rules, and also stricter enforcement regime. So as you said, NIS2 came into force recently, so in October of last year. But because it's a directive, it needs to be implemented in member states' national laws. And the general rule is that a covered entity is going to fall under the jurisdiction of the member state in which they're established. But with that said, most member states have now missed the transposition deadline. So the European Commission is really putting on pressure, but we should see them start putting in place their local laws sometime this year. So definitely on the watch list for a lot of in-scope firms. In terms of NIS2 requirements, I think there are 3 buckets to my mind. So you've got the cybersecurity risk management measures that are designed to, and I'm reading from the actual regulation here, to ensure a level of security of network and information systems appropriate to the risks posed. So to name just a couple of measures, so you've got policies on risk analysis and information system security. You've got incident handling, business continuity, and supply chain security. You have cyber hygiene practices and training on cybersecurity, and also the use of multi-factor authentication or continuous authentication solutions. So that's just to name a couple of those measures. Your second bucket is your incident reporting requirements. So of any incident that has a significant impact on the provision of a service. So early warnings need to be given within 24 hours of the business becoming aware of the issue. It broadly aligns with the incident reporting requirements under DORA, with the caveat that DORA requires an early notification of within 4 hours of the firm classifying. So that's kind of the saving grace of classifying an incident as major. And then finally, as different to NIS1, we now have governance and accountability requirements under NIS2. So the management bodies, generally your boards of directors of essential and important entities, are within scope of NIS2. They're required to approve and oversee the implementation of those cyber security risk management measures that we just talked about. So yeah, just definitely bringing that accountability in the mix as well.
Chris, any thoughts from you on how U.S. companies are thinking about NIS 2.0?
Sure. So as Emily had mentioned, what makes NIS different from DORA and some of the other regulations is that it's, of course, a directive. So I think part of the challenge is going to be that there are going to be 27 different flavors of NIS2 implemented in each of the countries. So I think that means that companies need to first figure out like what jurisdictions they're in. For companies that offer, the way that NIS2 is structured is that if you're a company that offers cloud or managed services, DNS, something that by its nature crosses borders, there's a different jurisdictional rule for that. So you have to follow the rules of the place where you have your main establishment, and you would, follow their law, report to them, etc. So you need to first of all figure out where that is. And then once you figure that out, there's actually an implementing regulation under NIS2 that gives very exacting security controls and incident reporting obligations that just apply to that subset of cross-border services like SaaS, etc. But if you fall outside that category into some of the other critical infrastructure categories, for example, water or telecom or these kinds of areas, then you have to follow the rules in each of the jurisdictions where you operate. So that could be up to 27. So I think a lot of this is going to be, first of all, checking out like what jurisdiction applies to you. What are the rules there? Where are there gaps, if any? And then work cross-functionally to address those gaps and have a plan to continue to monitor. So I think that's the way a lot of us are thinking about this. And my hope, as Emily had mentioned, there's only a few of the countries have passed laws. I think it's 8 of the last count of the last 27. What we're hoping to see is that, when these EU countries pass laws to implement a lot of the things that we just talked about, like business continuity or supply chain or crypto policies and things like that they will implement them in a way that it is consistent for companies that have to deal with all of that, right? So my hope would be, for example, that we wouldn't have to get the same service audited by a different auditor in each country, right? Across 27 countries, right? If it's the same service, or we could report any incidents at least, ideally it would be to one regulator, but if it's 27 regulators, then hopefully it's at least going to be a similar standard, right? So those are the kinds of things we're watching with and just really, hoping to see that from EU countries as they implement it.
Yeah, for sure. It also means that companies and CISOs are going to need to have an attorney on speed dial for every major incident that they have, and that they've got to make sure that their teams know they can't wait until the actual incident declaration to get counsel involved. They're going to have counsel involved from the outset when something starts to break that has the potential of being big. Because if you're waiting until the point in time where a major incident is declared, that's going to be too late. So that's really good points from the both of you.
It's worth adding here that there's a lot of overlap between NIS2 and DORA. So an ICT provider that's designated under DORA might also fall within scope of NIS2. But the general rule of thumb, just to sway some worries, is that where DORA applies, it will take precedence. So compliance with DORA will mean compliance with NIS2 as well.
Well, that's something. Although, the fact that you're doing your initial report for DORA within 4 hours is a really interesting challenge for U.S. companies, because you're going to be providing notice to your regulator in the EU of something, and it'll make some companies stop and think about the fact that the U.S. government isn't going to know about that, or the Australian government or the UK government, wherever their principal place of business may be. And so that will be a really interesting conversation for the lawyer that's filing that notice with the leadership team of the company. So that's another really tricky place to be.
The only thing I would say about that is that I think once you do submit a notification to a particular competent authority in the EU, the presumption is that they will probably be sharing that with their counterparts in other jurisdictions that might be affected as well. Yeah, I think it's implicit in the rules, the way that they're written, that is going to happen, at least on an intra-EU level, but also outside of the EU as well.
Yeah, and that begets part of the problem, right? Is that's why I have such a challenge with some of these regulations, because you've got 4 hours, you do the notice, it goes out to your national competent authority, and then that national competent authority spreads it to 27 member states. Then somebody in one of those member states does what? They call the guy they know at the tech company to say, is this going to impact us? And the guy at that tech company says, I have no idea. I've never heard of this. Why? Because they're 4 hours into the major incident response back at headquarters. Nobody's supposed to know about this. And so now something that was confidential starts hitting the vendors that support that government, the sales teams that support the company, and it starts to grow and gets ahead of the company's ability to respond. So this is a challenge, and it all arises in part, not all, it arises in part out of the tension of Spectre meltdown, and should the government know before industry or not? I get it. But the fact that governments have the ability to spread this information around before the response is even kicked off is extremely troublesome, because governments can use it offensively. Companies haven't started the defense, and I will stop ranting. Okay, moving on. So I've been a part of a number of queries from governments where they'll say, hey, I saw your outage report on Twitter, ... as a part of the NIS regulator will reach out. What do you do, Emily or Chris, with that social media savvy regulator who reaches out, or the DORA regulator? What do you tell them when you see those types of queries that come in?
So I think we need to be thoughtful about this because the reporting requirements really vary depending on what law you're talking about. Like, for example, SEC materiality. Not everything you read on the internet or see on the internet, even if true, is going to be material. I think we all get that. But there are some other laws like DORA we were just talking about, right? Where if you look at the threshold reporting requirements that financial institutions are held to, it actually has reputational impact as one of the thresholds, one of the two thresholds that would be met in that circumstance. And it talks about media reports or customer complaints as being a factor in reputation. So I think, first of all, context matters, right? And so when you get a call from a regulator, my thought is, like they probably saw something and they might be concerned and they're doing their job. And, we need to do what we can to help them be comfortable generally, right? So sometimes it's just a matter of telling them, yes, we're aware of the incidents that you're reading about, but it's something that we're looking at and it's not necessarily what we think it is, or it's something that, just so we're aware of the thresholds for reporting and don't worry, we will report if we meet them. So I think in the end, a lot, they're humans, right? And they're trying to do their job. So, it's something where we just try to figure out, first of all, what's driving the concern and then just try to work with that. That's my thought on that.
From a financial services perspective, and I think this is a view shared by my broader tech regulation colleagues, but I will not put words in their mouths, but enforcement action tends to, not always, but it tends to, or just supervisory actions generally, tends to result from a complaint or media attention, quite often like things that you see on the online newspapers, etc. And it's important for firms to be tracking these. But even if a firm is first becoming aware of a potential incident as a result of a regulator calling them up and saying, I saw this, I think it all hinges around having a good incident reporting process, which is what Chris is saying, that accurately identifies whether the incident is reportable in the first place. And without that process, that's where we see firms scrambling to try to respond.
I think that's really a good point, right? I mean, of course, we need to have a very tight incident reporting and just incident response process, but also having your comms team also plugged into that as well. And so when something like that comes in, you've got a cross-functional process with your incident response team, with your comms team, with your legal team, all working those so that there's one centralized process to be able to deal with those kinds of inquiries. I totally agree.
Yep. My responses were very consistent with where you were, Chris, which was always, thank you for paying such close attention. And when we have something that meets those reporting thresholds, obviously you'll be our first call. But it is an important thing to have those responses ready to go on the shelf. And to Emily's point, to have your comms teams thinking about that, because every tweet is something that a regulator is going to be paying attention to when there's an outage. And so that's really important to be thinking about from a risk and risk management perspective. So I wanted to shift gears a little bit because there was a third regulation that moved into force in December. It's been just absolutely snowing regulations in the EU lately, and that was the Cyber Resilience Act, which came into force in December 2024. Emily, do you want to give us just a quick overview of what the Cyber Resilience Act does?
Mm-hmm. So while we have DORA and NIS2 that are both sector focused, the Cyber Resilience Act is product focused. So it imposes obligations on manufacturers of products with digital elements that are provided to EU customers. The products in scope were first focused on connected devices, so things that connect to the internet. So your smart home device, your wearable fitness products, or connected toy, but it is broader than that. It captures software products as well and imposes obligations on mainly the manufacturers, but also some obligations on distributors of in-scope products. focusing on those manufactured ones, we have cybersecurity essential requirements. So, that the product has no known exploitable vulnerabilities, is secure by default, and that those vulnerabilities can be addressed through security updates. I think those are the main ones. There are a couple more. The other obligations would include things like that the product is accompanied by technical documentation and has instructions on security aspects, that a cybersecurity risk assessment during the product's lifecycle is undertaken, just starting from design onwards. And then you have the reporting of vulnerabilities to regulators and the public.
Go on.
You see Cristin laughing there. I feel like this isn't fair. So this is different to your incident reporting that we've covered under DORA and this too, where the reporting of the event occurs after the fact. So after the firm becomes aware that an incident has happened. Rather, this is a novel obligation where after the identification of a vulnerability, the manufacturer must report on that vulnerability to, this is less controversial, to all users of the product in a timely manner. The more controversially, to the member state's cybersecurity incidents response team within 24 hours. So this is where we have kind of awkward situation coming up where the firm might have to report before it even has a patch in place to send out to fix that vulnerability.
Yeah. So I feel a rant coming. I'll do my best to not rant too hard, but this is one where I feel like this is adding systemic risk to cybersecurity, because if a single device has a vulnerability that impacts a customer in Europe, that has to get reported, or a smattering of devices that has to get reported. And typically, those smatterings of devices, those are the nation state attacks or advanced actor attacks that are really the ones that are going to take some time and resources to go figure out and then go mitigate. That's not something you want reported in 24 hours. And then, as we just talked about in the previous segment, spread around 27 national competent authorities, and somebody calls the sales guy and you're off to the races and a bunch of vendors know. It is just not what you want. And so I think that similar to China requiring every vulnerability to get noticed to the government before it gets told to the vendors, this one is tell us when there's, a single customer in Europe or more that are being impacted. And so it's a little bit of a brighter line. But at the same time, if there's no mitigation in place that allows the party with that knowledge to use that for exploitation purposes or for whatever remediation purposes may exist, even though the company with the vulnerability who's trying to figure that out may not have a mitigation in place yet. So we're now sort of rolling the clock back to where we were before the Microsoft guys figured out the MAP program, when back in the days when the patch would get released and the hackers would go and figure out how to go attack systems before the patch was in place. So this takes us back to that era. And so I'm curious, how do companies think about what they can do to protect themselves and their customers when we have these reportable incidents that will start to arise? Obviously we have a little time because we've got the national implementations that have to go happen, but what should companies be doing?
Yeah, Cristin, you raised some good points here, right? And we do have some time before this actual reporting obligation is slated to come into effect, which is September 2026 by my count. And so for that, I think there's going to be a lot of discussion around this point, and a discussion needs to be had with EU regulators, because if you talk to EU regulators about this issue, they'll generally point out that their main goal here is to just protect EU infrastructure and to allow folks know when there is an incident that's being actively exploited. So you can understand why they would want that to happen. On the other hand, as you point out, there are some difficulties here. Like, what happens if you do find out about an incident, a vulnerability, and you have to go out and rush some kind of public statement? Because I think a lot of conscientious companies are going to want to go out and tell all of their customers at the same time, or, as telling a regulator even before, right? Because that's what a lot of companies are going to want to do. They're just going to want to think customer protection mode. That's the initial point. So if they do feel like they need to go out and do that very quickly, there could be some potential risks there, obviously, as you note. I think that, something we could be looking at is what counts as what starts the clock. Like, when does awareness begin? I mean, if we say that awareness begins once a company has, seen the vulnerability, confirmed the exploitation, traced it to the actual vulnerability, confirmed that, I mean, that's one thing, right? But if it's like, hey, a customer or a sales guy, as you just said, right, just calls me and I suspect there's a vulnerability out there and I better go look, if you start like putting the clock at that point, I mean, that's a whole different matter, right? And then you might start to see, if we see interpretations go that way and enforcement go that way, you may see some of the negative policy outcomes that you're talking about, right? Where companies may feel rushed to go out and hopefully they would have some mitigating guidance if they went out, but they may go out and have to just not completely be ready and have that guidance ready, or maybe even have it wrong, right? Because, people, may not be necessarily all correct, right? In the first 24 hours of trying to investigate based on just a suspected vulnerability.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I'm probably going to echo exactly what you said, Chris, but from a policy perspective, you can see what they're trying to do in the long term. They're trying to build at an institutional level, like this database of vulnerabilities to which products are susceptible in order that they can put out, technical standards, guidance to help prevent those things from happening again. From a long-term perspective, makes sense, but in the short term, yeah, massive issues. What I will say is, as Chris, you said, we're still very early days with CRA. So there is at least the hope that the obligations are going to be tapered so that they're applied proportionally and in flexible ways to prevent any other security issues from arising from notifications, right? That's the last thing that the regulators should want to do. So hopefully they introduce that proportionality. We'll see.
Here's the funny thing. If the regulators were really caring about security, they would actually be adopting something like CISA's known exploited vulnerability catalog, and they would be encouraging companies to go burn those down. Because I would bet there are far more companies currently exposed to known exploited vulnerabilities. Plug those holes first. Sort of like what the Ukrainians did in response to the Russians, right? Where they've had tremendous success being able to fight back against known vulns. Where take those off the table, that will do wonders for European resiliency, as opposed to adding risk to the system by identifying vulns that nobody knows how to fix yet, and then going to tell everybody, hey, here's this, brand new thing nobody knows how to fix, but best of luck, everybody. Anyways, end rant. So last topic, as we think about how these are three massive regulations with multi-billion-dollar consequences if Europe decides to really go for it in some of these cases. And if you add some of the tasting notes of the AI Act on top of it, where some of these may intersect at some point, it's got to have some impact on U.S. long-term cyber interests. And the U.S. has had a very long-term approach of don't regulate, use best practices, or sparing regulation. I'm curious, Chris, with so many regulations now in force in Europe, how do U.S. companies need to be thinking about this when the driving force had been best practices for so long?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, there's a tsunami of regulations coming out, not only from Europe, but around the world, as you've noted, right? So I think, especially if you're a major tech company that has to deal with just this huge amount of new controls coming out just from various jurisdictions, I think it's really important to have a system, right? Where you got a system where you ingest this common set of controls, right? And you can quickly convert those into some consistent controls that can be scaled across your enterprise. Try to automate that system. Have a system of just artifacts where, if you have an artifact and evidence that you need to meet the control for one, insert your regulator's requirement here. It can also be reused for the new one that comes next year over there, right? So there are various ways in which you can do this. At Cisco, we use something called the Cloud Controls Framework, the CCF, and we actually make it if you just use your favorite search engine and just put Cisco Cloud, controls framework, I mean, you'll find it. We make it available free of charge for folks who ask for it. So I think it's important to have something like that. And increasingly, as we're seeing more controls coming that impact on-prem software and hardware like CRA, to do something like that for on-prem software as well. And just the last thing I'll point out too is that a lot of regulators are looking for input on this, right? And in our experience, like when you do provide input, and Cristin and Emily, I'm sure you've seen, there is receptivity to that. And I would say in particular, what we've seen is that if it's of a technical nature, a lot of the regulators we talk to, they're very smart, but they're not necessarily have a deep technical background. So they really welcome, input on the technical aspects of these roles.
I think that's a really great point. If you have the opportunity to encourage a CISO to go meet with a regulator, what are the top 2 or 3 things you think a CISO should be advocating for?
Yeah, I think I can start on that one. So I think that in terms of what we're seeing with this, as we mentioned, this tsunami of regulations coming down the world, I think regulatory harmonization is something that we would really love to see, right? It's just an area where, like, if you do have multiple regulations that would require, let's say for a company to, for example, report to multiple agencies within the same government about the same incident using slightly different forms and questions, that can be something where, in the midst of an incident, you're having to draw your defenders off the front line to help you to answer these questions, right? And that's not something that moves the needle on security necessarily. And I would also point out that there are some areas where, for example, in CRA, where it's a bit of a new ballgame for a lot of companies in that we haven't seen actual software, like cloud software, hardware, connected software, being regulated in the way that we're seeing there. So I think there's a lot of room for input, going back to the theme on providing technical input, right? And right now with CRA, we do see a lot of standards groups. We see various groups that are there trying to provide these kind of common standards specifications. I think it's just really important that we get involved in those conversations and to help to sway those in a way that makes sense.
Emily, how about you?
I don't think I have anything to add, really. I agree. I think firms are dealing with this kind of 3D matrix of requirements that are kind of sector by sector, jurisdiction by jurisdiction, and even, if you think about the US, state by state, that they continuously are having to keep track of, and because of how rapidly regulatory priorities are shifting. So great for us lawyers, but near impossible for firms. And I wonder if it's actually letting those risks fall through the cracks a bit, because firms are so focused on compliance rather than, making those controls as strong as possible. So yeah, a real area for harmonization. Just those discussions with regulators are really important, not to be underestimated.
Such a great point. I think you're right. Once those CISOs go out to meet with European regulators, I think that state-by-state tour is a really good point, Chris, because as we see state legislatures coming into session here in the U.S., there's always a concern about state-by-state. We don't have comprehensive federal privacy regulations, so we've seen a state-by-state approach. There's a real risk of that happening from a cybersecurity perspective, and boy, would that be unfortunate. So maybe what we really need to see is instead of model clauses, we need to see model reporting and start to see some standards there. Okay, last question. If we were to change the U.S. approach to cybersecurity regulation, what do you think are the 1 to 2 biggest problems to tackle? Or just biggest problem to tackle, make it just one. And how would you solve that?
Only one, Cristin?
Only one.
Is that okay?
You have one problem to solve. What would you want to tackle first if you're going to solve cybersecurity regulation? What's the top of your pyramid?
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to think of one, but I mean, one that kind of I'll just raise is the amount of legacy and end of life equipment we see out there permeating through the infrastructure. I mean, it is something that is a difficult problem, and I think folks following this space, they all recognize the problem. I mean, that part's easy. The hard question is like, what do you do once you find it, right? Like, do you replace it? If so, who pays it? Who pays for the cost? Those kinds of things. I think maybe a step forward there could be to direct the kind of critical infrastructure owners and operators that have this type of equipment. I mean, just to better understand like what their gaps and dependencies are, and to kind of have a plan to close those gaps and at least understand like what those gaps would be and how to close it and have a risk mitigation plan, in the interim. I mean, is it possible, for example, to physically or logically isolate them from the rest of the network? Are there other compensating controls to be thinking about? One thing to be thinking about is something we think about at Cisco is how can we use AI to help with security, right? I mean, can we use AI to train on a particular infrastructure, do a baseline, look to see what good looks like so that it can better notice what bad looks like. And those are the kinds of things we're thinking about with our products like Hypershield. So there's a lot of areas to be thinking about it in this, but it's definitely a big problem that I think needs a lot of thought.
I love it. We do have to pay down our national technical debt. I couldn't agree more. Emily, how about you?
I am not a U.S. lawyer, but I will say, and I think this is probably just me being biased given what we've seen the EU do with DORA and this too. It's just around what we were talking about before, streamlining those requirements, just reducing compliance costs, and just from a practical perspective, allowing firms to actually spend more time on getting the controls right to actually address and remediate cyber incidents. And going further than that, I think what sets DORA is to hopefully for success in the EU, putting aside like some of the technicalities of model clauses, et cetera, is kind of the inbuilt accountability measures where management bodies are on the hook to approve and oversee risk management processes. And I think without this, that's where you start to see firms kind of having those thinking it's not going to happen to me. We're just going to be reactive. And just to get that understanding disseminated on a firm-wide basis, it just requires that good governance and accountability that is really hard to kind of set without having a harmonized standard across the jurisdiction.
Oh, I feel that. Well, January 1st marked my 25th year doing cybersecurity law. So I think I'll channel Oasis and I won't look back in anger. But I think if I had one thing to do, I look forward and I would actually merge a lot of privacy and cybersecurity law together, because I think AI is going to require that. It forces both domains together, and we have treated those domains so separately. And I think that AI is going to integrate them in ways that we're not considering and won't even talk about. And so I think that we're going to be behind the 8 ball if we don't shift that paradigm rapidly. So I think that there's a lot of work that's going to have to happen in the future to change all of that. And I think these regulations are going to create a lot of challenges because we'll have to harmonize all of that. But I'm sure the Europeans will give us paragraphs to figure that out. So with that, thank you for listening to Advancing Cyber. We hope you've enjoyed the discussion and that we've advanced cyber along the way. I want to thank our guests, Chris Hale and Emily Lemaire, and our Advancing Cyber team with management support from DC Cyber Communications, our sound engineer and third-year law student, Tanner Wilburn, and our student research intern, Layla Moeller. You can share ideas and recommendations via email at cyber@advancingcyber.com. Security is a community, and we always look forward to hearing from you. This is your host, Cristin Flynn Goodwin, saying thank you, patch your devices, and please turn on MFA.